You know this hero. The red suit. The blind lawyer. Hell's Kitchen. But the Daredevil you know was not the first. 24 years before Marvel ever printed that name, there was another Daredevil, and for a few short years in the 1940s, he was one of the most popular heroes in America. His first solo comic was literally titled Daredevil Battles Hitler. He fought a monster that became a legend. And then he was erased so completely that most comic fans today have never heard of him. This is the story of what happened to the first Daredevil. Look at this cover. A blue and red acrobat trading punches with Adolf Hitler himself, under enormous letters that read, Daredevil Battles Hitler. It went on sale in July of 1941, 5 full months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, before the United States had entered the war at all. To understand how a comic this bold existed, and how the hero on it could vanish so completely, we have to go back to the very beginning of the superhero, to a newsstand more crowded and more chaotic than anything comics would ever see again. In June of 1938, a single comic changed everything. Superman appeared in Action Comics #1, and he sold like nothing anyone had seen. Within a year, Batman followed. And every publisher in the business scrambled to invent heroes of their own. This was the start of what we now call the golden age of comics, a gold rush. Dozens of companies, hundreds of costumed characters, all fighting for a spot on the same spinner rack. Most of them would be forgotten within a decade. Our hero was one of the ones who deserved to be remembered. Here is something most people don't realize about those early comics. Under the copyright law of the time, a company had to actively renew its copyrights, or it lost them. And when the superhero boom collapsed after the war, dozens of publishers simply folded, and never renewed anything. Which means a huge number of Golden Age heroes are now in the public domain. Free. Anyone can use them. That single quirk of old paperwork is why the hero in this story can still be reprinted today, and it's also, strangely, part of the reason he was forgotten. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The book was called Silver Streak Comics. And the man behind it was one of the strangest figures in the entire history of the medium, a publisher named Lev Gleason. Gleason was a Harvard dropout, a First World War veteran, a former stockbroker, and, in the 1930s, a registered member of the Communist Party. He used his comics to push messages of social justice, he ran afoul of the government, and for years J. Edgar Hoover's FBI kept him under surveillance. Hold on to that, because Lev Gleason's politics will come back to haunt this story. But first, in September of 1940, he published something small that would become something huge. In the back of Silver Streak Comics #6, buried behind the lead features, there was an 8-page backup story by an artist named Jack Binder. It introduced a new character in a yellow and blue costume with a spiked belt. He had no superpowers. He carried no gun. His only weapon was a boomerang. And his origin was one of the darkest and strangest of the entire Golden Age. His name was Bart Hill. As a child, he watched criminals murder his father. And then, in front of him, they took a red-hot iron and branded him across the chest. The horror of it left the boy unable to speak, mute, for years. But the brand left a scar. And that scar was shaped like a boomerang. So the orphaned, silent boy grew up and taught himself to throw one, obsessively, endlessly, until he could knock a gun from a man's hand across a room, and pin a criminal to a wall, without ever saying a single word. He turned the mark of the worst moment of his life into a weapon. Think about how odd that made him. In an era of flying strongmen and magic rings, here was a hero with no powers at all, just an acrobat's body and a piece of curved wood. A silent avenger who let his weapon do the talking. It was a genuinely original idea, and it stood out. Interestingly, the muteness didn't last. By the very next issue, Bart Hill was speaking like anyone else, the silent gimmick quietly dropped and never really explained. Because by then, something bigger was about to happen to him, the arrival of the villain who would make him a star. A young artist had come onto the book, a man named Jack Cole, who, about a year later, would create one of the most beloved characters in comics. Plastic Man Cole was brilliant, and a little bit deranged in the best possible way. And Cole had already created a monster for Silver Streak Comics, a villain who had actually appeared before Daredevil ever did, a villain with no hero big enough to stop him. His name was the Claw. And Cole had the idea to point his new, revamped Daredevil directly at him. The Claw was not a man in a costume. He was a towering, yellow-skinned sorcerer with a mouth full of razor teeth and long, bony talons, a creature who called himself the God of Hate. He ruled a sinister Pacific island nation called Rika. His powers rose and fell with the phases of the moon. And when he was at full strength, he could grow, swelling up until he was tall enough to look down at skyscrapers, to wade through a city crushing buildings under his feet. He is, by any measure, one of the very first great supervillains in comics. And he is genuinely terrifying, even now. Picture it on the page in 1941, a colossal demon striding out of the ocean toward the American coastline, screaming for the death of a nation, while ordinary people run in terror below. This was horror movie imagery, in a 10-cent comic book, aimed at kids. Jack Cole understood something that a lot of his competitors didn't, that a hero is only ever as good as the thing he's up against. And he had built a monster worthy of a legend. Now he needed the battle to match. Starting in January of 1941, in Silver Streak Comics number 7, Cole staged what became one of the most famous stories of the Golden Age, Daredevil vs. the Claw. And he didn't wrap it up in one issue. He let it run, a sprawling, 5-part battle across issues 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. A serialized war between a boomerang-throwing acrobat and a god-sized demon. Readers had to come back, month after month, to see how it ended. It was event storytelling before anyone had the phrase. And it worked. The pages were chaos in the best way, a tiny red figure hurling boomerangs at a mountain of a monster, dodging talons the size of trains, refusing to stay down. And somewhere in this stretch, Daredevil got the look he'd keep for the rest of his career. He traded the yellow and blue for the now iconic split costume, one half red, one half blue, divided straight down the middle. It's a striking, unusual design, and it's the version most people picture when they finally do meet the original Daredevil. The duel built to a genuine climax, the little acrobat, battered and hopelessly outmatched, somehow bringing down a creature the size of a building through sheer nerve and a single well-thrown boomerang. Cole drew it with a wild, kinetic energy that still leaps off the page 80 years later. This was the sequence that cemented the character. Kids who had picked up Silver Streak Comics for its other features were now buying it for Daredevil, and Lev Gleason, watching his sales figures, understood exactly who was moving copies off the rack. The Claw battle made Daredevil the star of the book. He'd started as an 8-page afterthought in the back, now he was the reason people bought it. And the rivalry didn't stop at 5 issues. The Claw would return again and again as Daredevil's archenemy, their feud running for years, until the monster was finally killed off in the middle of the 1940s. But before that, riding the wave of his new fame, Daredevil got the thing every Golden Age hero was chasing. His own book. And its first issue is that cover we started with. Daredevil Battles Hitler, number 1, July 1941. Cover by Charles Biro and Bob Wood, 2 names we'll come back to. And remember the timing, this is 5 months before Pearl Harbor. America is officially neutral. And here is a comic book openly mocking Adolf Hitler, showing him getting punched in the face and, inside, fumbling with a crystal ball to plan his war. It was in the same fearless anti-Nazi spirit as Captain America's debut a few months earlier. These comics were taking a side before the country did, and kids loved them for it. After that first issue, the book settled into its real name, Daredevil Comics, and it took off. The writer and artist Charles Biro took over the character and would guide him for a remarkable 16 years, turning Daredevil into one of the most acclaimed heroes of the entire Golden Age. This wasn't a minor title struggling to survive. Daredevil Comics helped make Lev Gleason a major player in the industry. For a stretch in the early and mid-1940s, the first Daredevil was, genuinely, a hit. It's worth pausing on the talent behind all this, because it's genuinely remarkable. Jack Cole, who revamped Daredevil and built the Claw, would within a year create Plastic Man, one of the most inventive and flat-out funny comics ever drawn. Charles Biro, who guided Daredevil for 16 years, was a real innovator, pushing the medium toward moodier, more grown-up storytelling than anyone expected from a dime comic. These were not hacks cranking out filler. The first Daredevil was shaped by some of the best hands in the entire business, which only makes how completely he was forgotten that much stranger. And Lev Gleason was about to get much, much bigger, but not with a superhero at all. Because in 1942, Gleason, together with his two editors Charles Biro and Bob Wood, launched a comic that would change the whole industry, make them a fortune, and eventually help bring the entire company crashing down. To make room for it, they did something telling. They took Silver Streak Comics, the very book that had introduced Daredevil, and they converted it. Same numbering, brand new identity. It was called Crime Does Not Pay. And notice the small print on this first issue, formerly Silver Streak Comics. It picked up the old numbering and launched as issue 22, in 1942. It was the first true crime comic book ever made, lurid, violent, supposedly based on real cases, wrapped in a thin moral that crime, of course, does not pay. It essentially invented an entire genre. And it sold. It sold in numbers that make superhero comics of the day look quaint. By 1948, Crime Does Not Pay was selling around 1 million copies an issue, and its covers bragged of more than 5 million readers a month once you counted everyone who passed a copy around. It was so successful that everyone copied it. By the end of the 1940s, roughly 1 in every 7 comic books on the stands was a crime comic. Lev Gleason, the man the FBI was watching, had become one of the most successful publishers in America off the back of Blood, Bullets, and the Electric Chair. And that success is exactly what painted a target on his back. Meanwhile, something quiet was happening to Daredevil himself. Back in 1942, Charles Biro had added a gang of ordinary street kids to the book, the Little Wise Guys. They were sidekicks, at first, scrappy, funny, human, in a way the invincible hero wasn't. Readers adored them. Biro even did something almost unheard of for the time, he killed one of them off, for real, and let it stick. The kids felt alive. And slowly, issue by issue, they started taking up more and more of the book. Look at this cover. Daredevil Comics, Issue 70, 1950. The title still says Daredevil, but the hero is nowhere on it. Instead it's Pee-wee and the Little Wise Guys. By this issue, the kids had completely edged Daredevil out of his own book. The superhero who had punched Hitler and fought a god was simply phased out, replaced by the children who used to follow him around. He'd headline his own title for a few dozen more issues in name only, then disappear from it entirely. Superheroes were dying out across the whole industry, and the first Daredevil was one of the quiet casualties. By the late 1940s, the costumed heroes who had ruled the newsstand a few years earlier were vanishing almost everywhere. The audience had moved on, to crime, to horror, to romance, to westerns. Capes looked like a fad that had passed. But if the market had simply moved on, the first Daredevil might have quietly retired and been reprinted forever. That's not what happened. What happened next didn't just end a hero. It ended the company, and it destroyed some of the people who made him. In 1954, a psychiatrist named Frederick Wortham published a book called Seduction of the Innocent. In it, he argued that comic books, and crime comics above all, were corrupting the youth of America and breeding juvenile delinquents. The book landed like a bomb. Comics that had been harmless fun a year earlier were suddenly a national menace. Parents panicked. And the crime comic that had started it all, Crime Does Not Pay, was Exhibit A. That same year, the United States Senate held televised hearings on whether comic books were causing juvenile delinquency. It was a spectacle, and the industry was terrified. To save itself, it did something drastic. It created the Comics Code, a strict system of self-censorship that gutted exactly the kind of violent, lurid content that crime comics were built on. The word crime could barely appear on a cover. And Crime Does Not Pay, sanitized into something toothless, staggered on for only a few more issues before it was cancelled outright. And here is where Lev Gleason's politics came due. Back in 1946, he'd been hauled before a congressional committee over his left-wing associations, refused to cooperate, and was held in contempt. Now, in the 1950s, as the anti-comics panic and the anti-communist panic ran side by side, he was one of the most visible defenders of the medium. He'd even written a code of ethics for the industry, and yet, when he asked to defend comics before the Senate, he was turned down. Squeezed between a comics code that killed his crime titles and a government that had watched him for years, Lev Gleason's company went out of business in 1956. The book that had introduced Daredevil 16 years earlier died with it. And the human cost went further than a bankrupt company. Bob Wood, one of the two editors who built Crime Does Not Pay, co-creator of the comic that made all that money, came apart. In 1958, in a New York hotel room, after days of heavy drinking, Bob would beat a woman to death. He went to prison for it. And a few years after he got out, he was dead. The man who had grown rich publishing the words, "Crime Does Not Pay," had, in the end, lived out the sentence on the cover of his own comic. It is one of the grimmest true stories in the history of the medium. So the company was gone. The hero was already gone from his own book. And all those comics, Silver Streak, Daredevil, the whole Lev Gleason line, just sat there. Nobody renewed the copyrights. Remember that quirk in the old law from the start of our story? This is where it comes back. With no company left to protect them, and no renewals ever filed, the original Daredevil and his entire world quietly slipped into the public domain. He became free. Anyone could use him. And for decades, almost nobody did. He wasn't protected. He was just forgotten. And then, in 1964, the name came roaring back, attached to somebody else. Marvel Comics launched a brand new Daredevil, Matt Murdock, the blind lawyer of Hell's Kitchen, created by Stan Lee and Bill Everett. He had nothing to do with Bart Hill. Different hero, different origin, different publisher, the two Daredevils share only a word. But that word matters. Because here's the crucial distinction: the copyright on the original character had lapsed, which is why he's free to reprint. But Marvel now holds the trademark on the name Daredevil. Copyright covers the character and the stories. Trademark covers the brand, the name on the cover. And those are two completely different things. Which leads to the strangest twist of all. The original Daredevil is public domain, free for any creator to revive. But because Marvel owns the name, none of them are allowed to call him Daredevil. So he keeps coming back wearing different names. In 1991, AC Comics brought him back as Red Devil. In 2008, Dynamite revived him in Project Superpowers, with art by Alex Ross, as the Death-Defying Devil. And Eric Larson folded him into his long-running series Savage Dragon as the Dynamic Daredevil. The first Daredevil is still out there. He just has to answer to other names now, a ghost of the Golden Age, wearing a series of masks over the one name that's no longer his. So that's the story of the first Daredevil. A mute, branded boy with a boomerang, invented in the back pages of a dime comic. A hero who fought a god-sized demon, who punched Hitler before his country was even at war, who sold in the millions, and who was slowly pushed off his own cover by a gang of kids, while the ex-communist publisher who made him was ground down by censors and the FBI, and the men around him met genuinely tragic ends. He is not a footnote. He is one of the great forgotten stories of the Golden Age. And the best part is this. Because he's in the public domain, every single one of these comics is legal to read, right now, for free. The whole run is scanned and sitting online, waiting. You can go watch Bart Hill fight the Claw with your own eyes tonight. This channel exists to pull heroes like him back out of the archive, the first ones, the forgotten ones, the ones the famous names buried. If that's the kind of story you want more of, subscribe. There are a lot of forgotten first heroes down there. And I'm going to keep bringing them back up.